Signature Bank Studios.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Maybe the way to distinguish the morality of the two sides in Gaza, talking about the Israelis and Hamas, Hezbollah, is to do some thought experiments. Since it's so difficult for so many kids on college campus, so many leftist politicians in public office, so many of the professorate and university president cohort, so difficult for them to distinguish the two sides. The moral equivalences of I'm against killing, both sides. Think about it this way. If Hamas had the power and capacity to eradicate all Jews, would they do it?
I believe so, yes.
And if Israel had the power and capacity, and technically did they do, to eradicate all Palestinians without any, let's say, just to layer it on, without any sanction from the UN or governing bodies or anything other than some nasty op-eds in the West, would they do it? Sam Harris, who is one of the new atheists, along with people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and so forth. He's a philosopher, neuroscientist. He does this as well. He asks, take a moment to actually do the cognitive work. Imagine the Jews of Israel using their own women and children as human shields. And then imagine how Hamas or Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any other jihadist group would respond. The image you should have in your mind is a masterpiece of moral surrealism. It's preposterous. It's a Monty Python sketch where all the Jews die. Do you see what this asymmetry means? Can you see how deep it runs? There are not many bright lines that divide good and evil in our world, but this is one of them. By the way, as a quick aside, having a conversation with Sam Harris, the atheist, about good and evil and the basis of where his moral inveighing on this topic comes would be really interesting. Do you just think about that, Sam? Where does that come from? Anyway, I digress. Back to Sam Harris. He goes on to say, there's much more to be confused about. As this war proceeds, many people consider the deaths of non-combatants on the Palestinian side to be morally equivalent to the kids who were tortured and murdered at the peace concert by Hamas, or to the hostages who may yet be murdered and their murders broadcast on social media. But they're not the same. There's a difference between collateral damage, a euphemism for innocent people killed during war, and the intentional massacre of civilians for the purpose of maximizing horror. Simply counting the number of dead bodies is not a way of judging the moral balance here. Intentions matter, and that's what you see a lot of going on, too, is how many people were killed on this side versus how many people were killed on that side. Well, the context matters. The truth is that the Jews of Israel would live in peace with their neighbors if their neighbors weren't enthralled to genocidal fanatics. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Brendan O'Neill, who's the editor-in-chief chief political writer, I should say, at Spiked Online. He's also the author of the recently released A Heretic's Manifesto, Essays on the Unsayable. Brendan O'Neill, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. So, yeah, I mean, those sorts of thoughts experiments like Sam Harris offered, like I offered, is that the way to go? Is that maybe something that gets to the heart of the matter? Challenges people who are just reciting phrases, many people not knowing what they actually implicate?
I think so, yes. I think Sam Harris is right, that there is, even though we regret the loss of every civilian life, of course, everyone does, most people do, I should say, there is a difference, however, between so-called collateral damage, which is not a very nice phrase, but people who die as a consequence of conflict, and people who are killed because of their race, people who are purposefully targeted because they are Jewish, they're burnt alive in their homes, they had their throats slit, they were shot in the street, they were kidnapped, they were brutalized, they were driven through the streets where they were desecrated and spat on. There's a difference between those two things. The former happens in every war in history. It happens in wars all around the world, collateral damage, as they call it. But targeting a group of people on the basis of their ethnic heritage, on the basis of the fact that they come from a particular racial group, in quote marks, and killing them on that basis, which is what Hamas did in southern Israel on Saturday, the 7th of October, that is of a different order entirely. And that is why I think it is absolutely right to refer to what Hamas did as one of the wickedest racial crimes since the Holocaust, and certainly the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And so many in the West cannot grapple with the seriousness of that event. And in some cases, they've even celebrated it. And certainly they are now forgetting about it and moving on to, waving the Palestinian flag and forgetting about what happened on the 7th of October. It is not a morally serious society that forgets so quickly about an event like that.
And the other thing that you hear coming from that same crowd you're describing, calls for ceasefire. They move away from the actual events of October 7th to talk about, the 75-year history of ethnic cleansing or genocide, these terms that they throw around. I mean, there's never any. First of all, there's no defense for Israel doing anything. Israel's not allowed to do anything in their minds. And secondly, whatever is done against Israel, there's just this sort of moral plea that Israel is an apartheid state that has been killing Palestinians and otherwise engaged in barbaric acts for 75 years, so anything is justified.
That's right. They have dehumanized Israelis. They now talk about Israelis who are Israeli Jews in particular, let's be honest. They talk about them just as colonialists and settlers. They dehumanize them in that way. And that, there was one woke academic who said that settlers are not civilians. And therefore, who cares if they die? Who cares if they're burnt alive? Who cares if grandmothers are kidnapped and children are murdered? They're just settlers. They're evil people. So there's been this, ironically, neo-colonial dehumanization of Israeli Jews by supposed anti-colonialists here in the West. It's grimly fascinating and absolutely horrific. Yeah. I think what this conflict has exposed, I think, over the past 10 days is the hypocrisy and the cruelty of the woke elites in the West. We've seen student activists tearing down posters with the faces of the kidnapped Israeli children. We've seen that professor saying that he found the attack on southern Israel exhilarating. Here in the UK, we've had some left-wing commentators refer to that attack as a day of celebration, something we should rejoice. And these are the kind of people who rallied behind the Me Too banner. But now that young Jewish women are being kidnapped and brutalized, they haven't got a word to say about it. These are people who pose as anti-racist, and yet in the face of one of the worst acts of racist terrorism of modern times, they danced in the streets and they said, let's rejoice. The hypocrisy and the cruelty is staggering, and I think it's very hard for that section of the left to come back from this.
Do you think that this is going to end up being World War III? I mean, you have Hezbollah attacking on Israel from Lebanon, Syria militias targeting American troops in Iran and Syria. We had that USA Carney shot down 3 missiles from the Houthi rebels in Yemen. I mean, and they all have one thing in common. They're backed by Iran.
I think there is definitely the potential for this to spin out of control, certainly regionally. Whether it becomes a world event is not quite clear, but I think regionally the tensions are rising, and I think it could very well spin out of control. I think one thing that worries me is that I think the Western response to this conflict is going to exacerbate those tensions. I mean, just one example, if you look at the bombing of the hospital in Gaza, and the Western media very swiftly laid the blame for that on Israel. They said 500, maybe even 1,000 people had been killed. In response to that, there were huge and really rowdy protests in Turkey, Iran, all of them calling on their governments to sort out Israel. We now know that the story is far more complicated than that. It does look like it wasn't Israel. It looks like it was a misfired missile from Islamic Jihad inside Gaza. The death toll seems to be smaller than we initially thought. The hospital is still intact. seems to have been largely a fire in a car park. So when the BBC, which is respected around the world, runs instantaneously with the idea that Israel is to blame, when it takes at face value the claims of a virulently anti-Semitic terrorist group like Hamas, that risks inflaming the tensions in the region itself and the tensions around the world. And it's not surprising, the day after that hospital attack, a synagogue in Berlin was firebombed. And when Jewish institutions are being firebombed in Germany, we should all be incredibly worried. And that was done directly in response to the idea that Israel had just murdered children in a hospital. So the Israel haters in the West are playing with fire, and I don't think they realize it.
What is the situation on the ground in the UK? I think I saw your PM, Rishi Sunak, make a statement of condemnation, and I wonder if it's essentially mirrors the U.S., where you have academics and students on college campuses, particularly the elite college campuses, that have been, essentially brainwashed to support totalitarianism in all its forms, and the press corps, of course, and then you have the great mass of people, a majority of whom can apply some common sense and make the right determination about what's happening here. Is that the dynamic there, like it is here?
Yeah, it's a very similar dynamic. Rishi Sunak is being very firm that Britain is on the side of Israel. He's also saying, of course, that Britain doesn't want to see excessive deaths among Palestinian civilians. Of course, no one wants to see that, but he's made it very clear that we're on the side of Israel and that Israel has to win this war against Hamas, against this violent terror group. And then, of course, in academic circles, amongst the left, in activist circles, they are very much anti-Israel, poisonously anti-Israel in some instances. They're lying about Israel. They're glossing over the fact that Israel just suffered one of the most grotesque attacks on its civilians in its entire history. They're not talking about that at all. And they're on the streets waving the Palestinian flag, which I think everyone has the free speech right to wave the Palestinian flag. But they're also chanting, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free,
right,
which many people consider to be an annihilationist slogan. It's certainly a slogan beloved of Palestinian terror groups, because it implies more than the creation of a Palestinian state. It implies the destruction of the state of Israel. So between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, there would be no Israel. And in some people's minds, that means there'll be no Jews. It means getting Jews off Arab lands. So when you hear people chanting that in the streets, and a guy waving an Israeli flag was set upon by a vicious mob in London. He was almost attacked, but he was saved by the police. We saw a couple of protesters wearing images of paragliders to celebrate the Hamas terrorists who paraglided into southern Israel. So there is actually some celebration of this barbaric attack on the Jews. And I keep thinking to myself, what are these people going to tell their grandchildren? When their grandchildren say to them, Granddad, what did you do when there was the worst attack on the Jews since the Holocaust? Are they going to say, I went out on the streets and celebrated it? I mean, they don't understand how shameful their behavior is, I think.
What about the speech given by President Biden last night, where he linked support for Ukraine to support for Israel? How does that play in the UK? Is that where Britain is as well, the political class in Britain?
I think the political class is probably in that vicinity. I mean, we don't talk about Ukraine very much here at the moment. It has slightly faded. I think it's a more pressing discussion in the US because of Biden's support for Zelensky and for Ukraine. It's less of a discussion here. But one thing I find fascinating, whatever one might think of the Russia-Ukraine war and the two parties to that, I find it really interesting that so many people are comparing Israel to Russia. We're seeing that all the time here amongst liberal talking heads and of course on the left. But that's complete nonsense, because whatever one might think of the Ukrainian war effort, the Ukrainians did not go into Russia and massacre 20,000 people, which would have been the proportionate number in Russia as were killed in Israel. They didn't go in and set people on fire and kidnap grandmothers and children. They would have had to kidnap thousands to reach the proportionate level that Hamas did in Israel. So comparing Russia to Israel, which is what the left is doing, is completely surreal. I would or be on the side of Biden linking Ukraine and Israel as two countries that are defending themselves. But of course, it's very complicated because the Russian-Ukraine war is a complex conflict, whereas I think the Israel-Hamas war, as Sam Harris said, is a pretty clear-cut battle between one side that is defending good and civilians and decency, and the other side which is an apocalyptic anti-Semitic movement.
Brendan O'Neill, chief political writer at Spiked Online, and author of the recently released A Heretic's Manifesto, Essays on the Unsayable. Brendan O'Neill, thank you as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to podcasts of Dan and Amy from the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
A message brought to you by Paul Davis Restoration of North Chicago.